When you buy a new game, bring it home and turn it on, the presentation is the first thing that you notice. The game's graphics, the art style, how the game sets itself apart visually from the rest. The graphics might not be technically impressive, but if a game has a charming art style and is still able to capture your eye, that game is succeeding. That's why 2D sprite-based games are so recognizable and beloved by fans. Of course, the gameplay and the music play their part as well, but the art style is also iconic and stands the test of time. Castlevania 4, for example, is a 16-bit game, but the technical graphic limitations don't matter because the art style works. In the FPS genre, Doom had such a distinctive look to it that set it apart from other games at the time. Of course, technically it was way better than anything that came before it, but its depiction of Mars and Hell was very memorable, and the designs of the enemies and weapons are ingrained in gamers' minds.
These games are getting really realistic.
As the years went on, I think the FPS genre lost its charm for a while, even though that had more to do with game mechanics like slow movement speed and regenerating health. The art style of shooters was getting way less imaginative. It seemed like most were going for a realistic and gritty tone, which is fine, but when the bulk of FPS games from the 2000s were like this without much variation, it became tiresome. Of course, there were exceptions around this time like Halo, Borderlands, 13, and more, but it felt like this was the generic war era of FPS games. In the case of the Serious Sam franchise, Serious Sam the first encounter and the second encounter struck a pretty good balance of being cartoony and semi-realistic at the same time. The locations that you visit in Serious Sam 1 looked at least kinda realistic, since the entire game took place in Egypt, but it also had crazy set pieces and items. The enemies and some of the weapons in your arsenal are outlandish and have a cartoon look to them. The laser gun that you get later in the game looks like it's something ripped out of a comic book, and all of the monsters look so ridiculous compared to the environments. Even though Serious Sam 1's levels look semi-realistic, that doesn't mean they look gritty or boring to look at. In Serious Sam 2, they fully leaned into the cartoony art style, and while I haven't played the game personally yet, I'm in love with its wacky tone. All of the environments that I've seen look vibrant and colourful, and they don't care that it looks like a video game. They embrace it, in fact. Some could argue that the varying art styles between Serious Sam 1 and Serious Sam 2 might be too jarring, and some people might not like Serious Sam 2's look, which is completely fine, but there's a certain amount of undeniable charm that the game's art style has. Then Serious Sam 3 was released in 2011, and I want to say right off the bat that I don't hate this game, or even dislike it. When the game gets going and you start to get into fights with large hordes of enemies, Serious Sam 3 is really enjoyable. However, it takes a while until the game gets decent, and in the first 5 or so levels, the encounters are fairly boring without too much going on. Into the Spider's Nest is the second level of the game, and it's definitely the worst of the bunch, from what I've played. The overabundance of spiders is just fucking weird, and it's not even satisfying to kill them because the most effective way to do so is by performing that redundant execution move. Also, the section when you're in the dark with the flashlight turned on is just miserable, and the game doesn't improve for a while at least. The opening few levels are set in this bland looking city, and this is one of my main complaints with Serious Sam 3. The art style. There is no real style here, as it looks like the city levels were constructed for a standard military shooter rather than a Serious Sam game. Now the actual graphics look nice, with the texture detail and the particle effects being quite well done, but the art style is what I'm referring to here. Some games can have the best lighting and highest quality texturing, but if the overall aesthetic doesn't look appealing to the eye, then the graphical fidelity doesn't really count for much. It depends on the type of game, of course. Like Grand Theft Auto aims to emulate real-life locations, so there isn't going to be a need for stylized graphics. However, for a wacky throwback shooter, a gritty and realistic art style doesn't work. Everything looks pretty much the same for the first set of levels as well, and that's a real shame because that's exactly when the game is supposed to make a good first impression. The environments are gritty and generic, and when they are paired with the cartoony enemy design, they look like they're from two completely different games, which was not an issue with the first Serious Sam game. All of the environments looking the same doesn't help from a gameplay perspective either, since sometimes I get so turned around, and I keep running about the place looking like an asshole trying to figure out where I need to go. At least the gameplay is pretty solid, for the most part, and that makes up for the lackluster art style and piss poor opening levels. Once you get out of the city and into the typical Egyptian levels that the Serious Sam games are known for, the game as a whole improves. The combat encounters become more and more complex and are much larger in scale, and the art style actually resembles a Serious Sam game. I still think that the sections where you need to use the flashlight in the dark are lousy, as they still do show up periodically, but that's either here nor there. When you go inside the Syrian chamber and subsequently the Horus generator, there's a cool alien aesthetic on display and I'm a big fan of it. Sam also gets this Syrian bracelet later on in the game and that doesn't look realistic at all, which is good and what Serious Sam should lean into more. Again, I do want to stress that I generally enjoy Serious Sam 3, but the generic military shooter art style in the early levels took me out of the experience, and it made me initially think that the game didn't have an identity of its own. However, the game does improve later on, and it just suffers from a rough start. I mean, when Sam blows up the fucking Sphinx, that's some good stuff right there. That's the overall point I'm trying to make with this video though. Art style is important in video games and it can push players away just as easily as it can engage them. Art style matters, obviously not more so than the core gameplay and systems within games, but you do notice when the art is bland and it can put you off. With Serious Sam 3, the game is fun, but the art style does take a bit to get used to, and the early city levels are generic and can throw players off. What do you think about the importance of art style in video games? Let me know in the comments.
What do I know? Spend a night hitchhiking, where will I go? I can fly with my eyes closed, but it get kinda hard to see, it's no surprise though. I ain't hiding, I don't know my feet when I be blind.